Quickly before this tutorial starts, I have a massive holiday sale for my digital store. So if you want to get your hands on a lot of the plugins, which I used in this video, specifically, I'm bundling my Director 3D plugin with my character creator course. Director 3D plugin, it's my bestseller. Tons of really cool stuff in there. The character course is me holding your hand through everything I know about 3D characters. Director 3D is normally $77. The course is usually $200. You're getting both of those for $99. So you're saving a ton of money. Link at the top of the description if you want to check that out. What's going on, guys? Today, I'm going to give you a technical tutorial breakdown on this video, which I just made. This is essentially a challenge that I went through where I tried to recreate some scenes from the Elden Ring DLC in 1 week in 3D in Blender. Here's the final results. If you haven't seen this video first, I recommend you go and watch this because it does give a brief little rundown of what I'm doing. This video in particular is going to be a more in-depth tutorial where I'm going to show you a lot of the steps that I learned, because in the process of doing this, I did learn a lot of really cool tricks in Blender. Other than that, let's get started. Timestamps down below if you want to watch at your own pace. We're going to start off with this scene here. This is the 3D Mesmer character. I want to just take you through a little bit of my workflow for how I create a character in a fast and efficient manner, and that's by using Daz 3D. Now, there's pros and cons of using a character builder. The pro is obviously time. Daz 3D is a free software. You can just go over to figures over here. They have all these starter essentials, which come packaged with it. I can load in a basic male, a basic female, and then from here, it's basically like a video game where you have all of these different sliders for changing around your base mesh. They even have useful plugins like the Face Gen plugin, which I use a ton to take a picture of anybody, paste it onto a 3D character. I did that for the Elden Ring recreation video for that little intro scene where I'm kind of waving at the beginning. You do some really cool stuff with that. I made a guide on specifically that, as well as, again, in my course, I go over everything from the clothes to the hair, everything. But either way, Daz is great for saving time, but there's a lot of cons and traps that people fall into when they're trying to cheat and use character builders. So I want to go over that. I like to keep things simple and create my base mesh. Then you can use send to Daz to Blender. So you use Daz, you created your base mesh. From this point, what I like to do is switch over to sculpting mode, and I already did it for this character, but that's how I made a lot of these changes and just tried to give them some more personality from the default things that you get within Daz. From here, this is where I see a lot of people fall into the trap of overly using these character builders. A lot of people, they want to make a really cool character, add accessories and hats and things like that, but they don't know how to do that, so they just figure, oh, I'll go buy something on Daz in the marketplace and then just port it over. Now, whenever you do something like that, A, most of the time it's not going to look as good as it can, and B, a lot of the time you're going to run into issues, whether it's porting assets or things not being compatible, which can be easily avoided if you just know a couple of simple things within Blender. So I'm going to cover some of those simple things. Number one being just connecting objects to your characters. The nice thing about these Daz characters is they do come fully rigged, which is great, and I use that in the video just for all of the posing as well as animating. Essentially, you select the rig that comes already included, you switch over to pose mode, and then you can grab any of these bones, click G to move it around, click R to rotate. If you want to fully animate like I've done here, you essentially just add keyframes in between. When it comes to something like adding an accessory, so I'll click Shift D and say I want to connect this helmet to his head. I'm going to show you two different methods because I think for a lot of beginners, they can get confused. So you have your asset, you fit it to where you want. Now, option one is to parent it to the rig. Now, I want to show this just because it seems simple enough. It seems pretty simple, but I think a lot of people get confused. They click two things, they click Control P to parent, and it just doesn't work. So let me show you how we can fix this. So number one, you find the object that you want to connect. So in this case, it's my helmet. I'm going to search through. Here's the object in my object bin. So just keep in mind where it's at. Next, you select the bone that you want to parent. So I'm going to select the rig. I'm going to go over to pose mode. And this one right here is what controls the head. So you see if I click R, that's where I want to connect everything. So we have our bone selected. You want to control click that object that we were keeping in mind before. So control click the helmet. Control P to bring up your parenting, and then you can do bone. This is probably something you've heard before, but I think it's kind of confuses a lot of people, just the ordering of what to click. There's a lot of times where you just go click, click, Control P, nothing happens. Try and remember to do it that way where you find the object, click the bone, control click the object again, and then you parent. Now, another thing which is useful to know, and that's connecting things directly to the geometry using vertex parenting. So say, for example, I'm going to click Shift A and we'll just add in a simple cube and we'll just connect this. Say you want to connect something directly to the geometry of this character and have it follow along. I'll put it on the tip of his nose here. Go Object, Apply the Transforms. So what we can do here is we can select our character. We can click Tab to go into edit mode. Let's make this wireframe to see a bit better. Find the vertex that you would like to connect to. So for me, I'm just going to click the center of the nose. Then, just like we were parenting before, you want to find the cube, click it, Control P, make vertex parent. So those are just simple ways of connecting things to your character within Blender. Again, very basic information, but I figured when it comes to putting together a character, especially when you're cheating and using character builders and things like that, pretty good core base knowledge to know. So for accessories, hair, skin textures, customization, my best advice is to do that all within Blender. Try and keep the character builders to the minimum of base mesh and rigging if you really don't like doing that. So let's talk about the next issue that I ran into while making this character. As you can see here, this is just using what I already talked about, just taking my base character from Daz, using the sculpting tools in Blender to change around the face, using pose mode to give it a little bit of animation, and then using those parenting tricks to connect different things to the character. Now, the next thing that I ran into is the particles, and that was a huge issue because I said it in the original, there's a ton of different fire and flame and things going on, and particle simulations can be pretty tricky and pretty tanky on your computer. My computer, I have a 2060 GPU, so nothing crazy, especially at this point in time. So my solution was to use VDB files. And I recommend these a lot for people that just want to experiment a little bit with some of these simulations. So I do want to say, just like how using a character builder has pros and cons, using VDBs or any sort of preset has its own pros and cons as well. So in the original videos, I mentioned that my solution was to use VDB files. Specifically, I used a free trial of EmberGen, which is pretty straightforward. You just pick a preset and you change sliders. Again, just like character builders. You can find a lot of free VDBs or a lot of other ones on the internet and download them. EmberGen was pretty easy for me to use. Once you set up whatever it is you like, you just click export as VDB. Then to get it back into Blender, you download the Open VDB plugin, and this might actually be included in Blender from the start. At this point, I'm not really sure, but essentially once you have that in, you click Shift A here, you come down to volume, and then you can import your VDB just like that. So very easy. The downside is you don't really have control over the animation. And that's one of the biggest things that bothered me in my original creation. You can see the difference between the AAA Studio and my version. VDBs just kind of pop up. So really the only solution I had for any type of animation with that was just to come over here to the density here and to just keyframe it. So it goes from 0 to 100. At full speed, it's hard to really notice that, but to the trained eye, me personally, that was one of the biggest things that bothered me about that scene. Now, on the flip side of that, for this next scene here, where we have all these spears and the fire in the background, I thought that the VDB worked really well for that because the focus isn't really on the animation and creating this crazy sparkling spell or whatever. It's kind of a background atmospheric piece. Here's a look at what I mean by that. Let me just show you the shader editor, and you can see this is kind of a beefy scene with all the VDBs and stuff going on. Let me select the flame, and here it is. So if you want to just pause the video and copy this, this is essentially all it is. What you need to know about this to really control it. Whenever you export your VDBs, it's going to have different attributes attached to the files, mainly flames and smoke. What you're doing in Blender is taking that attribute and essentially changing it around by connecting color ramps. So if I was to go and change the color ramp colors here, it would change the color of the smoke, or it would change the color of the fire. If I wanted to specifically only change the smoke, I would change the attribute here and say smoke, just like that. And then I would use my color ramp to change only the smoke. There's a couple of tutorials already out on there. Again, all relevant, useful information I'll leave as sources down below. Also keep in mind, this is a printable volume node here. So you can control the density directly from there, and just make sure if you're doing this from scratch, you're connecting this to the volume node and not the surface. So all in all, I recommend you try out VDBs for your renders. You can really create some cool looking stuff. Now, again, just like using a character builder to cheat, if you use VDBs to cheat, you can run into some issues where you can't control the animation. We covered that. There's always a fix. If you want to make better characters, learn how to model, learn how to rig. If you want to make better particle things, learn how to use a tool like Houdini to do it all yourself. This is all stuff that, again, we did in 1 week. So I'm kind of just pushing the boundaries for what you can do in terms of these like shortcut methods, which I think is important to note as well. Other than that, for this scene, the only other maybe thing that's notable is for all of my backgrounds, I am using images to planes. Again, this is another Blender add-on. If you go to edit preferences, in my opinion, this one is a must-have. Spelled that wrong. Images to planes. I'll leave a link to that. Images as planes. You can load in your picture, which for me, I'm just taking a screenshot of the original background. If for any reason there was things I didn't want in the screenshot, I brought that into Photoshop, and then I used the generative fill just to expand the image. Another bonus to doing things that way is if we look at the shader editor, and I might lag a little bit here because we have cycles up in the background, but if we look at the shader editor, the way that I'm using these backgrounds is by plugging the image into the emission slot here. So this is actually going to be emitting light, which is very nice. I also have this little alternate setup here. And this I think is very useful for if you do want to use images as planes for compositing. Saves you just a ton of headache. I ended up creating a mask just to help with clipping of the images. And then I plugged that into the alpha slot. It just helped create a nicer sort of fade between the fog in the foreground and the background image. So just a little thing that I think helped a bit. All right, so another cool little trick, and I use this on the cape from that scene just to give it a little bit more movement without having to use wind, without having to use cloth. So in a nutshell, very easy. Let's just use a plane for an example. So what you can do is use the displace modifier. We'll search that up here. And in the displace modifier, we're going to create a new texture. And then once we've done that, we can go to the texture section and we're going to use clouds. So let's go ahead and shade smooth if you want. I'm going to add a subdivision surface just to really smooth this out. Go back to the texture. So this is a really good way just to fake cloth movement without any physics or anything that requires simulation. So if we bump this up to 2, it can go further than this as well. The max value just from slider is 2, but if you want, you can put it up to something like 10. There's a lot of really cool benefits to doing things this way. So for example, here's just like a base little like 3D print file cape. And let me just delete everything off here and start this from scratch. So 3D print file cape, we do the same thing. We add the displace modifier, create a new texture, set it to clouds. And now what we can do is we can actually use an empty to control this. So we're going to change the coordinates to object, Shift A and create an empty. And then we'll set that empty as our coordinate object. So if we take the empty and we move it around, now you see it's only going to sort of ripple around where we move the empty. You can actually go back to textures, and for this size value, depending on the mesh that you're using, if you're changing the slider, it only goes up to 2. But you can actually go higher than this if you just type it in. So if you want more like smooth ripple, you can go 10, for example. And there, as you can see, I'm just moving around the empty and you get a pretty nice looking ripple for any cloth. Now, if you want to animate this without having to move the empty, what we can do is just set a little keyframe. So we'll go to the yellow box, the object properties. We'll keyframe all these values at the beginning. Let's maybe move 60 frames and I'll just bring this down and then set that keyframe. Here's what that looks like. That's how much ripple we're getting in 60 frames. If you need to, you can adjust this value. Maybe we'll give it like 30 frames if it's windier. A little bit of that. And then if you want to, after this keyframe stops, nothing's going to happen. So we can select these keyframes, go to the graph editor, and then I think I'm covering it. Over here where it says modifiers, there's a little tab right here. I think you click N to show that. In this modifier section, we can just add in cycles. So it's just going to loop that animation all the way through. There you go. Cool little trick. Looks a little weird with this mesh just because it's kind of, this is just used for 3D printing. It's already kind of like draped in a certain way, but a nice little tip to know in general. So for the environment scenes, I talked a little bit about my 3-step simple method for how I made this. Essentially block out the environment, use a particle system. Let me drag that out. So essentially just particles set to hair, and then you set object under here in render or collection right here, instance collection. I just have a little collection of grass. That's how we're getting all the grass on the ground. These wireframe boxes, this is all fog just for creating depth. Again, images as planes for the background. One little thing that always helps, you can see how kind of a mess most of these 3D scenes I'm showing you are. That's why I think it's so important just to go to your camera view. You can do this split view just by, click and dragging out if you didn't already know that. And then you select your main camera, come down to the actual green camera settings, and under here in viewport display, this pass part out section, just for showing you what the camera, what the render is actually going to look like. Extremely, extremely important whenever you are going for overall composition. You can see it's kind of hard to figure everything out when you're doing it that way, but pass part out one, it just simplifies it. One really simple thing, which I think goes a long way, hyper focusing what the camera is actually seeing. Nothing else matters. But yeah, in terms of little tricks, if we find the actual cross thing, I kind of just modeled this with some cylinders. And then if we take a look at the shader editor, pretty simple. It's just an emission, pretty self-explanatory, but I also used transparent here. And I used just a little bit of math nodes just to kind of create this fade at the top. I was trying to think of how I could do that. I was thinking maybe just making a texture and tossing it into the alpha of a principal BSDF, but this actually got the job done. It's just a map range and then just a little bit of subtract by the length. Doubt I came up with that by itself. I probably looked up videos on ways to control textures and just finally got something I liked. But yeah, it kind of gives this little fade. Other things, if we look over in this top left section, this is just like a 3D scan of some like mountain, and these trees are all just 2D images. So yeah, if something's in the background like that, I don't think you really need to put a lot of time and effort. Again, using just images, and this is something I talk about a ton. I think I made a full environment guide on 2D image billboarding, which is essentially 2D images that are parented. If you see these little dashed lines right here, this is parented to the camera. So as the camera moves, these are going to always be facing the camera. It just makes them look more 3D. And even then, I mean, they still look pretty bad, but they're so far back in the background. It's easier and it makes the scene a little more lightweight. A lot of the background light stuff that you see in the original, that was actually done in After Effects. I didn't even bother trying to figure that out with light in 3D. So we'll talk about that at the end when we get to the post stuff. And then last little trick, I did a little bit of animation for this beginning part here. I think this is actually a geometry node system, and it's really stiff and ugly, as you can see in the top left there. But I think this is, yeah, geometry nodes. Just an instance just to get that little cluster. And then I just pop this into the rotation for the instances. Just a little rotate Euler and keyframing a noise texture. So that's how I'm getting this sort of just animated, a little bit of sway. Again, I thought it looked pretty stiff. It could still use a lot of work, but if you're going for like fake grass, again, not having to do any physics stuff, no wind stuff, there's ways to fake a lot of stuff in Blender. So moving on to landscape number 2. So for landscape number 2, I think maybe I got a little bit of practice working on the first one, and I got the composition of the original down a lot better in this one, I think. It may just be because the scene is a little bit more condensed, but here's what this looks like. So this water that you see right here, and it's actually animated by default, which is really nice. This is from my Director 3D plugin. It's a preset. You just click water and it looks very nice in cycles, in my opinion. Textures all set up and animated. So yeah, shameless plug. Director 3D helps with a lot. Same with these, same with this fog in the background. If I can find that, I think it might be hidden. So these, and again, it's just wireframe, but this little square that I have selected, this is just an image, like a ton of things I've been doing. It's just images as planes, and we'll go to the shader editor. We'll give you a look at that. So images as planes, here is the exact shader setup. It's literally just a video of fog, just stock footage of fog, and then it's plugged into transparent and emission. So try and zoom in there. You can kind of see it in the background. This is great for just 2D compositing. Very simple. Again, built into Director 3D. So I used that a lot just to save time on this. I used the same cross from the first landscape, threw in a bunch of just bushes here. And then I kind of worked with like some spotlight. I thought the lighting in the original was really cool. So this is a spotlight coming down here, and the spotlight going through this sort of long fog volume. So again, just principle volume for your fog, creating a spotlight that gives you this sort of like God ray coming in from the top. So I like this one a lot. Again, I think I said in the original video, the recreation video, environments are the best place to start. I was able to make this in 4 hours. Both of them took about 4 hours. So it's quick, it's easy, it teaches you a lot. Again, I'm not a professional. This is nowhere near like really good quality, but it's good enough by my standards. And it's not something that you're going to go crazy trying to figure out how to finish. It's something that beginners can tackle. All right. And then the final scene in Blender, I called this Project Flesh Mountain. I think in the original video, I made a joke and said it looked like taco meat, which even when I was making this, it was really weird. But anytime you're working with like fleshy textures for some reason in Blender, they just look really gross. And that's really just fun to work with from a texturing standpoint. But either way, I talked about in the original how I used geometry nodes to actually create this structure. So let me just walk you through how to do that. I started off with this collection here. So here's what I started with. I know I needed to take a bunch of different objects. In this case, this is just some like zombie mesh that I found on like maybe Turbo Squid or something. And I just posed it up and just gave them like weird dead body poses. So I did this about 6 times, 5 times, whatever, just to get some variation. Once I had the objects that I wanted to distribute, I ended up going in and just simple modeling with a cube. And again, I showed this, you just go into edit mode. This one was really easy because if you look at the overall shape, it literally looks low poly, and it just goes to show things don't have to be super complex. Whenever you're just using like cool things like geometry nodes, kind of get away with it. So yeah, essentially just that. Now, it's also important to know whenever you are distributing on points, that's the keyword there, on the points. So we want to make sure there's a lot of points to actually distribute. So we have this sort of even distribution of these. You can see this exact kind of shape, if that makes sense. So essentially just subdivide it. Subdivide, give it a lot of points. We go into point mode, there you go. Once you have that sort of setup, we switch over to the geometry node editor and we click new. And this is the exact node setup that I used. I tweaked a little bit, but I used this setup, which I'm going to show you for like 6 different things in that video. I used it for creating this structure. I used it for the giant crowd of like 200 pro artists at the intro. I used it for anything that required just like a large distribution of objects. So essentially it is just distribute points on faces. And you can see here's what that looks like. If you need to change the way the points are, you can subdivide more. Now we want to distribute on those points, or I should say instance on those points. Plug that in there. And now it's going to ask for your instance object right here. And in that case, it is a collection. You can do this with a single object, or if you want variation, you can put them all in a collection. So you take this and you just straight drag it into the geometry node editor. You plug that into instance, and there you go. So something as simple as that, it allows you to create some really cool stuff, whether that's the forest that I was showing you earlier, whether that's giant crowds of people. You can even have them all animated. I've done that in the past. And then the cool thing about geometry nodes is you have a lot more control over what you want to do once you're at this point. So what I did is I just wanted some random rotation for each of these. You can see they're just perfectly stacked on top. I wanted like this jumbled mess. So pretty easy fix. I went for rotate instances. And then anytime you want randomness, you just search for random value. Plug that into the rotation and maybe, give it a little bit more. So yeah, there you go. Control density straight from here if you need more. And then from there, it was just kind of messing with textures. Again, trying to give them some like weird fleshy textures. See if I can take a look. I think this is just like the base zombie one. Maybe I did some stuff here. Just color ramp, just to give it that kind of reddish, pinkish. And then as well as some roughness, probably just to make it kind of shiny. Yeah, that's kind of the basics just for using geometry nodes. By far, my favorite tool in all of Blender. not just for distributing, but you can take this steps further to do some really, really cool stuff. Not to keep beating a dead horse here, but Director 3D, I did a ton of geometry node stuff in there because I love how you can take these crazy nodes. I'm just going to put on the screen here the geometry node setup for some of the things that I did, like the forest builder, crazy nodes, and you can package those all together by connecting to the group output so that the user just clicks on modifiers and they have everything nice and organized. They can change everything. It's modular. Creating your own system like that, in my opinion, is invaluable, especially if you're creating assets that you're going to be reusing multiple times and you want changes and variation. So I'm going to leave my geometry node environment tutorial down below. If you're interested in this, watch that video. And there's also a huge like inspiration video attached to that where it's a game dev talking about how he uses Blender geometry nodes to create all these game world designs. Super cool stuff if you're nerding out about the tech things. So yeah, there's a breakdown of everything in the 3D software. If there are any other particular things that you want to know, maybe just like basics like lighting, rendering, texturing, whatever. Like I said, I'm going to make that Blender bootcamp. So leave me feedback down below and I'll include that in the bootcamp just so I can have it covered because I'm kind of assuming you guys know a lot of stuff as I talk about this. So yeah, if there's something in particular that you're confused by, let me know down below and I'll make sure to cover that. Let's hop into After Effects, and I want to talk about the post-production for these renders because that's a big part of what goes into this. All right, so for the post work in After Effects, and I'm only going to show one scene because all of these steps that I do once I have my render and bring it into After Effects for every scene, pretty much across the board, all basically the same. So my goal here when I bring it into After Effects is just to make it look less like a 3D render and more like it was shot out of a camera. And a lot of that is just subtle little things. So you really don't even have to worry about it too much when you're going for something like video game graphics or a video game cinematic, just because it's not pure realism anyway. But even if you're not going full on realism, it's still nice to have. And I still think it makes the render look better. So when it comes to making something look like it was shot on a camera, there's a couple of things. Number one is noise. And again, extremely subtle. You just don't want your images to be so crisp that, you know, if you zoom into anything, even like the most HD camera, you're going to see noise. So you want some noise in there. See, I'm just tossing these on adjustment layers. Number two is the heat distortion. And this isn't required for all of them, but obviously for one like this, where he's like holding fire up to his face, you see it in the original you see it in the original AAA version. There is some heat distortion. And for that, I'm using Universe Heatwave plugin. That one's very nice. It's just going to add some blur and some rippling. Next, this one, not necessary whatsoever, but if you do want a little like bump in the sharpness, I think tossing an unsharpened mask in there can bring a lot of those tiny details out. Obviously, the color grading. I mostly do all of my color grading in Premiere after the fact, but for this one, I did do it in After Effects. Just apply color LUT, give it a little bit more cinema. We have a vignette in there as well. Optional step. So yeah, essentially you just want a little bit of grain. You want blurring because not everything is going to be perfectly sharp. For blur in particular, I actually like to use another Universe plugin. You're not forced to use Universe plugins. You can recreate this from scratch in After Effects. It's just a time saver. Essentially, it's just masking and blurring. But the Universe one I use is called Universe Chromatic Blur, I think. It adds a little bit of RGB on the edges, which a little bit of camera realism. You can even add lens flare overlays if you want if you want to even beautify the renders even more. Just taking those extra little steps to work on the render after the fact, I think it can bring things out a lot. I think that you should view Blender as just giving solid foundation, solid bones to the render, and then anything that you need to fix, you can use render passes, bring them into After Effects, and have control over everything. So yeah, don't feel like you need to nail everything perfectly in the render. A lot of the times, you hear it all the time, fix it in post. Yeah, something like this, again, just taking a little bit of extra time in post, just to make a little bit of changes, or just to do things that would be a kind of a bother to do in 3D, but you can do super easy in After Effects. And I think you even noticed this, or at least I think this is what they did. in the original AAA version. So I'll try and pull it up here. But if you just look at the tree, I'm pretty sure that's just a 2D image like what I did. And I'm pretty sure that a lot of that subtle little movement in the background, that's just doing something like the liquefy tool in After Effects, where you're just making a tiny little movement on a 2D image. So I did the same exact thing. This is my comp just for this like end portion. And liquefy is just kind of like for to add a little bit of movement on the tree. The 3D camera tracker is actually for these little things here. And I mean, if you look hard enough, they stand out a lot. I didn't really, if we take a look at it. So this is just from the image, but in the original, there's all these little fragments just flying everywhere. So I did 3D camera tracker onto the scene, and then I just made some little black solids like this, made them 3D layers right here. You can just check that switch on. Once you 3D camera track, they'll move like the footage is moving. I just keyframe them just to kind of float up. If you're looking for it, it's super obvious. They look like little kind of faded Doritos just kind of floating around. But again, if you're just looking for subtle animation, subtle movement, a lot of the times I think it's way better just to do it in your compositing tool after the fact with the render, especially if it's a large scene. Yeah, that is all of my little After Effects tips and tricks. I've been saying do it in post, but the truth is, if you are like a Blender guru, there are a lot of people who do all their compositing in Blender, and that's just their personal preference. So it is up to you. I learned After Effects first, so I just feel very comfortable in After Effects. But yeah, the principle of it stays the same. The more time you put into the render, the nicer it's going to look. Even for these renders where I was trying to do like one in a day, one in every 2 days, just taking that render and putting in a little bit of extra time just to sprinkle some stuff like that in, I think it helped a lot.